Hello and welcome to this edition of Africa This Week, your wrap of what happened across the continent. I'm Mashood Masuta. Nigeria's House of Representatives this week threatened that it will place a ceiling on all debts and borrowings by the country's federal government. A 90-day ultimatum to President Goodluck Jonathan by the House of Representatives to fix a debt ceiling has elapsed. Dr. Patterson Ikioche, a fellow at the African Institute for Applied Economics, explained.
The House of Reps, they are in the right direction because that's what the Fiscal Responsibility Act stipulates in Part 12, that the president within 90 days of the function of the effect of that particular act will, in consultation with the Ministry of Finance, but with clearance with the with the National Assembly, determine what the debt ceiling should be. So that's the step in the right direction.
Are they talking about numbers? Are they certain numbers that they're looking at in terms of what that debt ceiling would be?
Can I get your question correctly, please?
The debt ceiling, they would like. Are they talking about numbers? Are there any numbers that you have heard that they would like that ceiling to be at?
Well, the debt ceiling should be determined by the Minister of Finance. There's a way of calculating it. We have the Debt Management Office that runs the debt sustainability analysis following the World Bank IMF framework. With that, by the time the president then presents it to them, of course, the National Assembly has its own backup personnel who will equally get into such analysis and then finally come up with what the debt ceiling should be, the consolidated debt ceiling of the federal, state, and local governments.
Doctor, earlier on, I think it was around April, the finance minister had said that debt to GDP in Nigeria was 17.8%, and she was arguing that it was below the 30% target set for the Nigerian economy. So if you're looking at 17.8 right now and the target is 30, it seems as though Nigeria is well below the target that it should be. So what are the actual concerns?
Sorry, can I get your question again? The actual components of what?
The finance minister had said that the target for the economy, the debt target for the economy, set for the economy, is 30%. And debt to GDP right now in Nigeria is about 17.8, which seems to be much lower than the 30% that has been set for the economy. So what I'm asking is that if you're at 17.8% and the target that has been set is 30%, what are the concerns?
Yeah, the concern there is that we have a rising debt profile. You know, the thing is beginning to rise again, and if care is not taken, we may not have the chances of securing the future. You know, we may not have the chances of really keeping a stop to it because the thing is gradually rising now, even though it's 17 point something percent to that of GDP, but the ceiling, you know, the benchmark is 40% to GDP, even though there are other indicators of measuring the debt ratio, you know, the revenue of the government as well as the export. But securing that with the GDP is still below the threshold, you know, following the IMF World Bank scenario. But then one shouldn't be looking at that. The point is that the debt profile is rising over time, and if care is not taken, we might not really be securing the future.
The UNCTAD World Investment Report highlights the fact that global foreign direct investment surpassed the pre-crisis average last year. George Meyer, Head of Research and Information at the IDC, unpacked the report.
The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development released the World Investment Report today, showing that foreign direct investment flows globally rose to $1.5 trillion last year. That is up from the 1.3 trillion of 2010, and it puts us about just above the average for 2005 to 2007, but we're still below the 2007 peak.
So how should
globally.
we be thinking about this? Is this good? Is this less than expected, more than expected, encouraging, good for the countries that are getting this investment?
I think it's good news. It's good news, first of all, because of course it's the type of investment activity that bodes well for long-run economic development and job creation and so on. But secondly, the fact that all major economic groupings in the world actually benefited from this increase in FDI. So whether we are talking about developing countries, which by the way took about 45% of the total last year, to developed countries, which actually saw a turnaround of about 21% increase in FDI inflows, so that is good news. There was a turnaround in Europe from a very negative picture to a more positive one. The US itself carried on attracting some investment. And the only disappointing one there was Japan. And of course, even transition economies benefited as such.
David's going to make a point now, but no one ever mentions Japan anymore. Have you noticed? We never talk about Japan. David?
No, I just wanted to ask George, what about, is China taking the bulk of that 45%? Is most of it going there, or are they being challenged by other developing nations?
Yes. East and Southeast Asia, together with Latin America, actually took the bulk of the increase from the developing country standpoint. So as expected, as was to be expected. However, it's important to note that even if we come to the African continent per se, even though perhaps what will make headline news is the fact that there was for the third consecutive year, there was a marginal decline in inflows into Africa. And it was really from about $43 billion US dollars to $42 billion US dollars. This marginal decline is actually attributable to what happened in North Africa. Because in North Africa, which has traditionally taken about a third of Africa's FDI inflows, obviously countries like Egypt and Libya saw protracted political and social instability, and their FDI inflows ground to a halt. In sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, there was a substantial increase of about 25% year on year. So that was very good news, with Southern Africa attracting quite a substantial amount of flows.
South Africa's 5.8 billion.
That's correct.
Where did that go?
Now, South Africa itself.
I'm trying to find that.
South Africa, of course, one of the top 5 recipients of foreign direct investment last year. Nigeria topped the list, with, of course, oil being the biggest magnet. After South Africa, in second place, we had Ghana, also attracting.
I'm trying to think where the South Africa would that
because
be?
of oil.
Sasol, no, South
I'll get to that.
Okay.
So we had Ghana, we had Congo Brazzaville, and then we had Algeria. So as you can see, out of the top 5, 4 of them are either oil or gas producers, right?
But
So
if for South Africa, as David says, and come to Warwick in a moment, $5.8 billion, that's times 8 at the prevailing rate today.
Yeah, that's right.
That's 40 billion rand.
That's
as
right.
David says, where's this going?
Now the 5. Okay, you have to. Of course, the South African case is quite. You typically have very strong ups and downs in FDI flows into South Africa, quite often related to the very sizable acquisition type transactions that take place.
While global trade is weakening, a remarkable long-term rebalancing in world trade has taken place over the past decade. We discussed how South Africa can ride that structural shift in global economy with Franti Pai, emerging markets economist at Stanlib.
When we got invited to the BRICS, or when we joined the BRICS, our main thing was our economies are not as big as they are, but certainly we're at the doorstep of Africa. And it seems to be the case now that even though that was our playing game, we haven't actually looked as deeply into Africa, going into the growth of Africa, which 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are actually in Africa. And so we need to actually be looking at that and looking at the more important and rising sectors within Africa.
I want to talk about protectionist measures, because this is something that became such a buzzword, particularly in the financial crisis, because of a lot of economies protecting their own economies, and what we've seen is that when it comes to trade imbalances, where Africa for a long time, even at Doha, we saw that fall apart, where you had these emerging economies say, you know what, we want to be able to operate in your economy the way you're operating in ours. And it seems as though some of the developing, not all of them, but some of the developing countries have made some kind of progress there, but Africa not doing so great. And it still seems that we're at a disadvantage when it comes to that trade balance.
Sure, absolutely. And I think one part of that stems from the fact that many of these countries, for example, have strong manufacturing sectors. They've got, and they've always dependent on their exports in large part. And therefore, we haven't taken the advantage that we have in Africa to trade and invest amongst each other, among, for example, manufacturing sectors, agriculture, and then we can use that as our own basis in which to trade interregionally. And I think that's something quite important. We've always also assumed also that this idea that South Africa is part of BRICS means that, we have a free trade agreement in which we can just, send our goods and they will be welcome. But there's a long history there of stories of protectionism, of exchange rates and all of that. Why is it that we are not looking here and looking at what strengths we have to share amongst each other, whether, for example, we are, busy with construction, infrastructure, and that sort of thing. And I think that's what we should be looking at as investors and obviously trade partners.
I want to take a little bit of focus on manufacturing, because you have had people say that manufacturing and expanding manufacturing in any economy is such an amazing way to be able to provide jobs, because that's where people that don't really have, high-end skills would be able to go in there and would be able to contribute, would create jobs. So what I would like to ask you, just in terms of, the BRICS and where they are, and some of the offerings that we have seem quite similar. What Brazil offers, what India offers, what China offers, you find that we seem to be competing, in terms of our product offering.
Sure.
Is that a fair assessment?
Well, exactly. I think we've all, sort of said, well, for example, in South Africa, we import a lot of clothes from China. Everything is made in China. But there are other areas in manufacturing. When we talk manufacturing, for example, we can also talk agro-processing. So, and in sub-Saharan Africa, we look at countries such as Zambia that has great arable land. South Africans are very good at farming. We've been doing it for quite some time, and we've said sometimes we've complained about the idea that, water is a problem and we have to import it maybe from Lesotho. And then you come to this part of the world, that is sub-Saharan Africa, that's quite rich in land. Why is it that we are not producing food from there and then agro-processing, bringing it to high levels? And I think that's something that we have a proper into.
South Africa is a nation of poultry eaters, which has made the country attractive to exporters. South Africa and Brazil are now at a showdown over the flooding of the South African market by Brazilian poultry importers. We asked Gareth Lloyd-Jones, MD EcoWise, and Kevin Lovell, CEO of the South African Poultry Association, for more insights.
The term bailout, I think, is probably the wrong term. I would say that what's probably a better term is to look at a way that the playing fields can be leveled opposite the imports that are coming into the country, so that there's fair competition amongst all, because those playing fields are not level. And I think the second thing is to look at a macroeconomic picture and understand what the impact of those imports would have on our country from an employment point of view and from a food security point of view going forward.
Okay, before we go to Joburg, what do you mean the playing fields are not level?
Well, just to put it in perspective, South Africa slaughters about 19 million birds a week, whereas Brazil, for example, one of the players does about 145 million a week. So they've geared their entire industry up to export. I mean, it was a government initiative. Brazil, the government provides them with subsidies on maize, to gear them up to export. So really, it is a situation where the playing fields aren't that level, and then you bring in the rand in terms of hedging against that. And again, you've got another situation in terms of the price the product can be landed here.
Okay, well, let's go to Joburg now and speak to Kevin to see if he agrees with that. Kevin, is that a fair assessment of your sentiments as well? The thing that I would ask is, why doesn't the South African industry and the South African government do exactly what the Brazilian government has done and gear the South African market for exports as well? I mean, trade one off against the other, or is that not feasible?
Well, we'd really like to be able to export to all the countries that are importing into us. So the Brazilians, for example, can happily send to us and we can't send to them. So the market's closed for a range of technical and health type reasons. Most of them are can be easily overcome if we wanted to. But we're not really looking so much as a bailout. What we're actually talking about here is something like the Motor Industry Development Program, which is a long-term support for an industry, and it has long-term benefits. Currently, the motor industry has about 100 billion rand turnover. That's the component and the cars. And it employs many thousands of people. We're about a 50 billion rand industry, and we're not as big as the cars, but we feel that we have something significant to offer because we offer rural stability and a rural economy. We simply cannot compete against Brazil without being part of a government-sanctioned program of support.
Okay, let's talk about now the consumer side of things. I mean, forgive me for being simplistic. The only thing I know about chickens is that I keep 2 chickens at home and they lay eggs for me because I'm a vegetarian. But let me look at it this way: the people just down the road from this studio in Khayelitsha and the smart people just across the mountain in Constantia, if they can buy a chicken that tastes pretty good, it doesn't matter where it comes from. If it's cheaper coming from Brazil, then surely that is in the interest of the consumer, or is it not that simple?
Well, there are two ways of looking at this. The one is that chicken that comes in from most countries in the world is cheaper than South African chicken, and Gareth alluded to one of the reasons, which is the price of feed, maize and soya, which we pay a lot more for. On technical efficiency levels, we're actually better than the Americans, for example, and almost as good as the Brazilians. But on price competitive, we're not there. Then there's also unfair trade, dumping and things like that. So yes, the person in Khayelitsha or Constantia, whichever one you choose, would be able to buy imported chicken at a lower price. However, where does the job come from that provides the disposable income to pay for that chicken? And secondly, where does the foreign exchange come from? Last year, we imported on the FOB, or free on board level, about 2.8 billion rands worth of chicken. This year, if you take the first 4 months and you turn it into annualized figure, which is a bit risky to do that, it's about 3.6 billion. So in other words, we've wasted a few billion rand unnecessarily on something that we're perfectly able to produce and would have led to that amount of economic activity or more in South Africa. You've got to weigh the two up. Definitely there would be a price increase if imports were severely restricted. We would never want them to be stopped. But surely the many thousands of jobs, we estimate, depending on the volumes of imports that are curtailed, around about 15 to 25,000 jobs are possible directly, and then there's a whole lot of indirect jobs. The maize, the chicken industry is the second biggest user of maize in South Africa, and we're the growth market for maize farmers and for soya farmers, because people aren't eating more maize as a starch. They're using bread, pasta, rice, things like that as they move up the economic ladder. So we're the growth market not only for retail in South Africa, we're the single biggest part of food retail, chicken, but we're also the growth market for maize. So we have there are all these links, just like they were with the motor industry plan. So I would be cautious to say that cheap is cheap.
After the break, more stories making headlines this week.